Welcome to the What Really Happened radio show. Putting America first, second, and third. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. And just as we were coming into the show, I was typing a reply to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which just sent me a notice that Curiosity on Mars is approaching its one-year anniversary and has accomplished its major scientific agenda of showing that Mars could have once supported life. And I don't know about you, but I get really bothered when I hear about scientific achievement phrased in terms of could be, might have, maybe did. Nobody wants to actually bet a nickel on a declarative statement over there at NASA. NASA stands for never a straight answer. So I was shooting them an email to gently remind them that back on the Viking missions, the labeled release experiment did in fact show indigenous microbial life in the Martian soil. And the gas chromatograph mass spectrometer on which NASA based its decision to say there is no life on Mars was a flawed design that could never, ever have actually detected the organic molecules it was supposed to look for because of the perchlorate content of the Martian soil. So I was just nagging them saying, you know, it has been 30 years, and this never a straight answer policy is starting to really annoy those of us who worked on the Viking missions, and it is time to sort of say, yeah, you guys, we, NASA management, made the wrong call. You guys were right. We were wrong. And yes, you were. All right, on to more serious things. Today is Friday, August 2nd, 2013. End of the week. Thank goodness it's Friday. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, 800-313-9443. Sam, the man, is in our control room managing the Truth Warp Drive, ready to answer the phone when you call on in. And, of course, Claire will be joining us in our third hour today. She's got some interesting topics to talk about, so you may want to stick around for that. Now, obviously, starting right off from the daily dose of bovine excrement we are getting from the corporate media, terror threat prompts U.S. embassy closures overseas. Note the plural. This is coming out of CNN. Al-Qaeda is linked to a terror threat that has prompted the State Department to direct its embassies in key Middle Eastern nations, including Egypt and Israel, to close on Sunday. And they're saying, it's another terror threat and so forth and so on. Directed at American targets overseas. And I'm sure right now in the White House, Obama is saying, yeah, this is going to take their mind off of Benghazi. Let's get a really big bang over there somewhere. That'll take their minds off IRS targeting of my political enemies. That'll take their mind off of Department of Justice spying on reporters and NSA spying on everybody else here. But it's very interesting. I mean, the State Department's issued travel advisories to Americans. Don't go to all these countries, and they're basically listing the entire Middle East. And I wonder why they're closing so many embassies and why they don't seem to be sure just where these Al-Qaeda, nudge, nudge, wink, wink terrorists are going to strike. I mean, if the NSA spying is good enough that the police can kick down the door of people who Google backpack and pressure cooker, then in theory, they should know exactly who these terrorists are, what they're planning to do, where they plan to do it, when they plan to do it, and be in a position to stop them before it actually happens. Because that's the advertising. All this NSA spying is here to prevent terror attacks. So if one actually happens, conveniently timed to distract us all from Floodgate and try and reignite the war fever to fling our babies onto the designated enemy's bayonets, it proves that all this NSA spying doesn't really work for its stated objectives of thwarting crime and thwarting terror. It's all about keeping watch on law-abiding American citizens to keep us all obedient slaves to Wall Street's money junkies. And we already know this is the case. We've already proved with our 3 NSA challenges. The NSA will not be able to find real terrorists or real criminals who have the wherewithal to develop their own private encryption methods. They can't do it. All they can do is sit there and say, you, the law-abiding American people, will use our legally mandated encryption standards that we can already read. It's basically their whole attitude. Now, almost as a punctuation mark to that whole idea, the FBI has now announced that even though they were recording all of the phone calls of the Tsarnaev brothers for months ahead of the Boston Marathon bombing, that there was really nothing they could have done to have averted that attack. Even with all the spying they admit they were doing on the Sarnia, no way they could stop it from happening. Well, I'll tell you how you end terrorism. It's really very simple. If you want to stop terrorism, stop screwing around with other people's countries and the terrorists will go home. I mean, it's not like somebody is sitting in their home and they're just saying, oh, man, there's nothing but reruns on TV and I got nothing better to do. I think I'll go blow up a school bus and hope I don't burn my lips on the exhaust pipe. From the British Crown's point of view in 1779, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were terrorists. Anybody who refused to fight the British soldiers standing in a line in brightly colored uniforms that make easy targets was considered a terrorist. And so we're back to this same situation. If there is another, let me rephrase that. When there is another terror attack, and we know there's grounds to believe they're all just staged theater pieces to try and anger us and point us at a designated enemy. But when there is another terrorist attack, what we, the American people, should be thinking is, aha, this proves all the spying doesn't work. All the reading of our emails, the scanning of our Facebook, the looting of our cell phones and tablets as we walk around here, all of the crotch groping at the airport, none of it works. Billions and billions and billions of dollars that could be going to our schools or to feed our hungry is being wasted on something that absolutely will not do what the government claims it's supposed to be doing. Can't stop crime, can't stop terror. The fact that they're out here saying we have this generalized Al-Qaeda threat all over the Middle East tells you they don't know. They're just guessing. They heard a rumor. They saw a Twitter and said, oh, my goodness. Or they waterboarded somebody down in Guantanamo who said, I heard it from Miss Cleo's psychic hotline that Al-Qaeda will strike somewhere. So the government's in kind of a very, very awkward place here. On the one hand, I'm sure they're desperate to stage a new terror attack to take our minds off Benghazi and IRS Gate and DOJ Gate and EPA Gate and IRS Gate and the rest of it. But the instant they do, the American people are going to say, see, all this NSA spying stuff doesn't really work. Talk about a rock and a hard place. Now, despite all the hue and cry about Edward Snowden, and the U.S. government throwing their tantrum about how dare Russia let Snowden live inside their country. How dare you do that? Harumph, harumph. The actual reality is, according to the United States military themselves, Edward Snowden's, I'm rephrasing, I misread that. Manning's leaks, Bradley Manning, his leaks of war crimes committed by the military did not actually result in any U.S. deaths. And the same thing is true of Edward Snowden. He didn't leak out anything of military nature to our enemies. He blew the whistle on government wrongdoing here. Now, let's get on to Benghazi because there's a lot of interesting developments happening there. CNN, no less than CNN, is reporting that the Central Intelligence Agency is now engaged in a massive intimidation campaign against anybody who was anywhere near the Benghazi consulate to keep it a secret. Apparently there are reports of a second round of confidentiality agreements that people are being forced to sign. If you ever talk about this, you will vanish from the face of the earth. No due process, no Bill of Rights. We will come into your home and kill you, and your family, and your dog, and your goldfish. Interesting story over an Investment Watch blog where apparently some of the key witnesses to what actually went down in Benghazi have been relocated all across the U.S., moved out of Washington, D.C., moved away to Montana, and being given new identities. Probably managing the Wendy's up in Billings, Montana by now. Does this not seem like the acts of a government with something to hide? Yeah, it does to me. And when we come back, I'm going to reiterate what I think happened in Benghazi and why they're working so hard to keep this thing under wraps. Welcome back to the show. We're talking about Benghazi and the revelations that are even breaking into the corporate media of an almost panicked effort by the U.S. government to keep the lid on information regarding Benghazi, to the point where some of the witnesses around there have been dispersed across the United States and given new identities. According to another report coming out of CNN, some of the people that were involved in the Benghazi mission are being polygraphed every single month. to make sure they are not talking to Congress or the media. Can you smell the fear? If they don't have something to hide about Benghazi, why go to these extremes? If what happened in Benghazi matched the official story, they don't need to hide people. They don't need to have witnesses sign confidentiality agreements. They don't need to be polygraphing their people every single month. They don't need to hide people in other parts of the country under new identities. These are all the signs that whatever happened in Benghazi is not what you're being told. And what I think happened in Benghazi, and I'm not the only one to say so, a lot of people have now come out with this idea. Last summer, year ago, ahead of the election, polls showed the presidential race neck and neck. A lot of media outlets were already predicting a Romney victory. Now, Obama tried to build his electability by standing on the body of that dead guy they killed in Abbottabad and claimed was Osama bin Laden. But because of the independent media blowing the whistle on all the phony pictures, they leaked onto the website to try and make it look like, yes, they got bin Laden, when we all know the real Osama bin Laden died in late 2001 of natural causes. So Obama couldn't get traction off of that. They kept trying and trying to say he's the president who got Osama bin Laden, and they weren't getting any traction with it. So he needed something to increase his approval rating, to look presidential, which he had failed to do for the preceding 3.5 years. Obama needed a publicity stunt. So a small team of al-Qaeda terrorists, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, say no more, meaning somebody playing at being al-Qaeda terrorists, were, I think, supposed to enter the consulate and take the ambassador and his staff hostage. Oh, my goodness, it's another hostage crisis just like we had in Iran. Will Obama allow it to drag on for months and years the way Jimmy Carter did? And then Obama would let the drama build for a few days. The media would be just all aflutter. Oh, it's the Benghazi hostage crisis. And then Obama would resolve the crisis quickly, either by sending in the SEAL teams who'd been told to stand down during the actual attack to rescue the hostages, or arrange a prisoner swap. That was another theory being floated at the time. And then Obama could campaign on how he did not let the situation turn into a repeat of the Iranian hostage crisis, that he wasn't another Jimmy Carter. And all of this, of course, would have dovetailed with the ongoing propaganda agenda of bashing Iran, Muslims in general. It came out right on top of that movie Argo talking about the Iranian hostage crisis. It was all well-timed and well-planned, but the best-laid plans of mice and men and candidates gang after glay. We know the CIA operatives at the annex who were told to stay where they were could hear the gunfire from the consulate. We also know the SEALs were ordered to stand down, but some of them refused that order. Now, if you study the location of the consulate through Google Earth, you see heavily populated residential areas less than half a mile to the east and southwest, who no doubt also heard the gunfire coming from the consulate as well. Now, given how quickly all these sympathetic protests erupted across the Middle East following this incident, it's clear the region is an anti-American powder keg waiting a spark. And Obama inadvertently supplied that spark with this staged election season campaign trick. So this initial al-Qaeda, or reasonable facsimile thereof, was a small group under the control of the U.S. government. But they were quickly joined by hundreds and hundreds of Libyans pouring in from the adjoining neighborhoods saying, "Get the great Satan." And what started out as a planned and rehearsed operation to kidnap and then rescue the ambassador for Obama's election campaign triggered a spontaneous riot with at least 200 participants on the ground, spun out of control, leading to the deaths of the ambassador and the others. And Obama's carefully prepped operation to make himself look like a hero instantly turned into an epic fail. And the evidence that supports this is the stand-down orders to CIA and the SEALs, the presence of a Predator drone overhead when the attack began, and Predators are not that fast. They're built for endurance And they only hit about 137 miles an hour, so that Predator had to have been launched and in the air on the way to Benghazi in order to be overstationed when the attack began. And now we have this situation where people who are witnesses to Benghazi are being deliberately hidden, relocated, new identities, being forced to sign confidentiality agreements according to ISA, being polygraphed every single month to make sure they're not talking to members of Congress or the media. These are all the hallmarks of a major cover-up of a major blunder in place. Going to grab a couple of phone calls here. Mike in North Carolina. Aloha, Mike. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, aloha, Mike.
Aloha.
Yeah, the Benghazi thing and Al Qaeda is just a joke, because as you're talking about Benghazi and as you're addressing that issue, you know, we're reading things out of even some of the mainstream media about us funding Al Qaeda in Syria and now in Afghanistan.
Yeah, isn't that weird? We can fund Al Qaeda, but we can't fund Detroit.
Oh no, but we can build a $500 million stadium in Detroit.
Well, the taxpayers are getting soaked for that.
Yeah, but the workers don't deserve their pensions. We got to build a stadium. Side issue. I wanted to call you specifically about, and you're the only one that I've seen doing it. It's the anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Yes.
And that was kind of one of my concentrations when I was in grad school. And I really like that you're putting that out there, because the false narrative that has been played, and you know, I used to teach history, so I've read it in the textbooks, is just it's outrageous, because we didn't need to drop those bombs and everybody knew it.
Well, we didn't need to drop the bombs to end the war. Japan was already trying to surrender. They'd actually dispensed one of the imperial family, one of the princes, was trying to basically get a meeting with the Allies to say, we've had it, we're done, we want to surrender. After the first bomb was dropped, Japan tried to surrender again, and the U.S. went ahead and dropped the bombs. And the reason they did that was because under Roosevelt and then later Truman, the United States had invested a tremendous amount of money to develop these new weapons. And they wanted to demonstrate to the rest of the world, primarily the Soviet Union, that not only the United States had these weapons, they had the political will to use them. And that is really the lesson we need to take away from this. For all this talk about Iraq's non-existent nuclear weapons and all this talk about Iran's non-existent nuclear weapons, in all of human history, only one nation has ever actually used a nuclear weapon of mass destruction on the civilians of another country, and that is the United States of America.
Yeah, Mike, it even goes deeper than that. Peace feelers had already been put out. They've been put out through the Soviet Union. Stimson knew about them. The president knew about them, and Japan had already at that point formed a Supreme Council to end the war. So
they were trying to get out of it. They were looking to get out of it when the bombs fell. We got to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. America, welcome back to the show. And the corporate media is back to pushing terror, 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 terror. They're running a story now about how the suspect in the Fort Hood shooting has now released documents to the corporate media. Now, up until now, he has been held completely away from the corporate media, and I want to point out something very clear. The Fort Hood suspect did not show up at Fox News and hand them the paper. The government handed Fox News some papers saying this is from the Fort Hood suspect, which makes the documents themselves suspect. Because the documents say, yes, it was an act of terror, which is not the story we were getting from on the ground. And they're pushing that terror thing very, very hard, so it smells like we're getting ready for another false flag someplace in the hope that Americans will be stupid enough to fall for it yet again. We're going to go back to the phones here. Werner in Canada. Aloha. Werner, welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Like earlier in the show, you mentioned there about all those false flags.
Yes.
There's something posted I came across a few days ago. The Great Tomato Bubble, last 240 years of history. And history keeps repeating itself and repeating itself and repeating itself.
That's what's wrong with history.
And as I say, nowadays, with all that information that's available, the only way they can keep all this deception under wraps is by causing the people to become brain dead.
Well, you know, there's almost a path that gets followed where a government starts telling little tiny lies, and when they start to get caught out, they have to start telling bigger lies. Then they have to start resorting to fraud in the official reports like the economy. And then when those start coming out, they have to go to the scare tactics, and it just keeps escalating and escalating, using larger wrongdoing to cover the earlier smaller wrongdoing until it reaches a point of collapse, where the people are just absolutely now aware that this government can't really do anything at all other than kill people and come out with more lies and more deceptions. And the fact that they're all of a sudden ramping up this whole thing about terror, Fort Hood suspect, Al-Qaeda, planning some attack in the Mideast against U.S. assets. And again, you need to understand, Al-Qaeda itself is a fake. It's as manufactured as Emmanuel Goldstein in George Orwell's 1984. The literal translation of Al-Qaeda is the base, and the name is thought to have originated at the CIA for the database of the Mujahideen fighters who were supporting the United States, including a very young Osama bin Laden, against the Soviet Union. And so Al-Qaeda just became this villain they could fling at anybody they wanted to. But the problem is, in Arabic slang, Al-Qaeda means a toilet. And Araish Al-Qaeda means I'm going to the bathroom. And if you're a real terrorist group fighting against the great Satan of the United States of America, you're not going to call yourself the toilet.
Well, it's a French Revolution, and in the aftermath, it was said the revolution devours her children.
It does.
And the same way holds true for all those great deceptions that have been peddled over the years. In the end, those that get involved, they get devoured by their own compatriots.
Well, those are the ones that get discovered. I mean, up until now, the U.S. government has gotten away with most of its deceptions. By the time the deceptions became known, it was such ancient history, people didn't really care. By the time we found out that the Warren Commission had lied about the assassination of John F. Kennedy, most people said, that's just business as usual. Doesn't affect me. I'm not excited. By the time we found out there really were no torpedoes in the Gulf of Tonkin that escalated the Vietnam War, most people say, Vietnam's over and done. We don't need to worry about that. But in the days of the age of the Internet and the independent media, the lifespan of a government lie can be clocked with an egg timer. I mean, look how quickly the fraud of 9/11 was exposed. Look how quickly the fraud of Saddam's weapons of mass destruction was exposed. And apparently our government is not able to evolve and adapt to a new environment in which governments can't get away with these kinds of lies and deceptions any longer. And that is why it is doomed to eventual extinction.
Well, the issue is about foreign aid. And the big elephant in the room is completely ignored about the billions of dollars that flow every year to this entity in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think more and more people are aware of it. You've got all of these to the point where Israel is now literally putting paid agents on college campuses to try and counter the boycott and divestment maneuver. You have people like Ryan Dawson, who's mounted his No More Foreign Aid to Israel campaign, which has now apparently reached such a point of success where the Israeli media is now complaining about him. And very clearly, looking at global polls of the image and reputation of both the United States and Israel, they are very much in decline. And so all of these carefully crafted illusions about how, these two nations are democracies and stand for human rights and peace and all the rest of it, people just aren't buying it any longer. And both nations are very much in decline. The danger, of course, is both nations have nuclear weapons and a willingness to push the button as a last resort prior to final capitulation. And that's why it's such a dangerous time right now.
Yep. There will be wickedness in high places. They will deceive and they will get deceived. And the people are caught in between.
Absolutely. It is the curse of political power in that it attracts the very kind of people who should not be allowed to have it. Okay, Werner, we're going to let you go. We're running out of time, and I want to switch over to Patrick in Texas. Patrick, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind today?
Hey, how you doing, Mike?
Great.
I wanted to talk. Thank you. Oh, great. I wanted to talk about, some of the little lies that you were talking about, like the lie that we are a democracy, and we are not a democracy. We're a republic, and a lot of people don't know that being a republic, the byproduct of being a republic is a democracy. And those are really, really very important things, because in a democracy, it's a mob rule type of thing. In a republic, a minority and the majority are both protected, and they're able to convey and express their point of view without persecution or fear of persecution.
Well, that was the way. Before I let you go on, under the Constitution, the United States was set up as a republic with a democratically elected leadership. In other words, nobody was allowed to be in the government of the republic without the permission of the people. That's what gave the people power over that government. Over time, of course, with massive election fraud, the undue influence of excessive wealth over the election and media process, we have lost that. We are a classic fascist economic dictatorship with a carefully crafted illusion that the people are somehow still in control of what's going on in this country. And of course, most Americans are now aware that simply isn't so any longer. Elections are routinely stolen. Candidates are pre-screened by the money junkies. And anybody who's not going to toe the line for Wall Street or Israel is driven out before they can even get to the ballot box. We saw that with Ron Paul in 2008 and 2012. And so the system has become completely corrupted, and I don't think there's really any way to save it. We're just going to have to sit quietly and be patient until it all comes crashing down. And I think it's imminent, and I'm not the only one saying that.
You're absolutely right. And the other thing that a lot of people don't know about, Snowden, because there's the argument that he jeopardized, the United States and their special interests and all that other stuff, and that's a bunch of bull, because basically what they don't know is the NSA is not a U.S. entity. It's a foreign intelligence agency, and you can have I forgot what's the general's name of
Clapper.
the NSA? Clapper. He will say in his little Q&As that he has to try to save face with the NSA that he says we are a foreign intelligence agency. So the argument that
hold it. What he means by that is saying the original jurisdiction of the Foreign Intelligence Service Act was a U.S. organization that was tasked with spying on foreign governments and foreign people. That's what he means when he says the NSA is a foreign intelligence service. He doesn't mean it's controlled by a foreign government. It means they're watching foreigners. Unfortunately, they have violated their mandate. The Foreign Intelligence Service Act court is now authorizing domestic surveillance. They're trying to create law out of thin air, saying it's legal to spy on law-abiding American citizens. But the NSA is an agency of the United States government, and the United States government bears the responsibility for its violation of the Fourth Amendment.
Well, and from my perspective, I'm looking at, the United States government corporation and not the actual republic, which we're actually protected under the Constitution, which, in my view, is a foreign entity. And it's an illegal entity. The corporation of the United States, which is in control of the Federal Reserve and all our current foreign policies, which is, wreaking havoc upon Americans like me and you, is just terrible.
Well, we have to take a break for commercials here, and let me sign off with you by saying the Federal Reserve is not under anybody's control. We've got Alan Greenspan on tape saying that the Federal Reserve private central bank is not answerable to any federal government agency. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. We're dealing with some technical glitches here, but hopefully they're under control for right now. More information continues to come out from Edward Snowden's document dump to Glenn Greenwald, including the recent revelation that the British Spy Center, the GCHQ, was paid 100 million British pounds, I think that roughly works out to $150 million, by the NSA for mass surveillance of the population. And now the British people are very, very upset, asking if the government is now operating itself as a rent-out service, where for a fee they will spy on the British people for the benefit of a foreign government. Welcome to our world, AIPAC spy scandal. Now, one of the judges at the Foreign Intelligence Service Act Court, the FISA Court, is trying to duck the blame that people are putting onto it, because the word foreign in there, both in the court and in the original legislation, says that the jurisdiction of this court is only outside the United States of America, but they have been authorizing spy operations everywhere on law-abiding American citizens. And now they're trying to duck the blame by saying that there was a legal means for any company to challenge an order to share information on customers with the NSA, and none of those companies ever complained, probably because they didn't want IRS audits up the yin-yang for the rest of their lives, or some of their cars to start exploding. But they're trying to duck the blame by saying, hey, there was a mechanism by which they could refuse and challenge this, and none of them even bothered to try, so it's not our fault. Take the blame over to Facebook and Yahoo and Microsoft and all those other companies. They're the bad guys. So this scandal has reached the point where everybody, they're starting to point fingers. And when they reach that point, it means there's no longer a cohesive management of the scandal. Everybody is now panicking and thinking about themselves, and it's at this point more leaks and more whistleblowers usually start to come forward. So it's starting to fragment. Now, Dianne Feinstein openly says she is not really well versed in high technology. She's not a techie, but she's absolutely convinced that the National Security Agency can't abuse surveillance. She has an absolute, she believes they would never, ever do anything wrong. And this is the lady who's supposed to be in charge of congressional oversight of what's going on. She doesn't know the technology. She doesn't know what they're actually doing, but she's absolutely firm in her belief there are no abuses against law-abiding American citizens. Meanwhile, interesting footnote to all of this stuff, Colin Powell is in a little bit of hot water. Apparently, some unknown hacker broke into his email archives. Maybe he had them stored up on Google or something, and leaked a bunch of emails between Colin Powell and a female Romanian diplomat that he was sort of very friendly with while he was Secretary of State. Basically making it sound like he was catching a little on the side. Now, of course, Colin Powell is denying that there was an extramarital affair, although he has advised this diplomat to delete all the mails. But if she was a honey trap and Colin Powell fell into it, they're never going to delete those emails. They're going to hold them over Colin Powell's head anytime he might be of use to them. And so, if we set aside for a moment and say this wasn't NSA or CIA doing this, the real danger and risk to the nation and its government is that all those back doors built into our computer systems by the NSA are being discovered by foreign governments and criminal hackers who are not going to hesitate to use them. Far from protecting and guarding the national security, this NSA spy system that they have created has actually made the nation and its political leadership far more vulnerable by creating these little trap doors that the hackers are going to find. And for anybody who was actually paying attention to that Black Hat convention in Las Vegas, I have to admit, it is rather amazing and clever, the things that they are finding. Apparently, somebody documented how you can hijack an iPhone or a tablet using a power supply that plugs into the wall and connects over the USB port. There can be a chip inside that little power supply that will access the computer and replace the browser with a hacked browser that looks exactly the same, that will open up the computer to all kinds of manipulation. So all of these systems are vulnerable. Are they vulnerable just because nobody's paying attention? Or are the hackers finding all these built-in back doors in the hardware and software that were there for law enforcement and are now wide open to criminals? Well, it's a rhetorical question. We already know that's happened. When the FBI put out their Magic Lantern virus to plant on the computers of people they wanted to keep an eye on, computer hackers started making their virus and malware look exactly like Magic Lantern to the virus scanners, knowing the virus scanners would simply pass it on through. But you know, it's really funny, when you have a dictatorship that feels they must have a certain capability, its possible harm to others is hardly ever a factor. And I think a good example of that would be the aftermath of the Fukushima power station destruction. Now, we know Stuxnet was designed and engineered by American and Israeli cyber warriors. They like to call themselves cyber warriors, to interfere with these Siemens industrial controllers that are standard use on nuclear power station facilities. We also know Stuxnet broke out and went wild, was wrecking equipment all over Asia. And we know Stuxnet was in computers in Japan surrounding the Fukushima power station before the quake and tsunami. And as Fukushima continues to pour out more and more radiation, and it becomes more obvious that this thing is far from over, there is an unanswered question. Was Stuxnet, which was designed to interfere with Siemens industrial controllers and nuclear facilities, actually inside the Siemens controllers at Fukushima itself? Because it's known that many of the emergency systems that were supposed to work to shut down and cool that reactor were not working properly when the disaster hit. But for all those people who are caught in the mindset, we have to get Iran no matter what, well, we screwed up Fukushima, well, you know, these things happen, you know. My face is red. Meanwhile, this actually got some attention on the corporate media. Over in Seattle, city officials are sending out memos restricting certain words and phrases in all city communication. We don't want to have words or phrases that might be offensive. Because while we may be torturing innocent people to death to find weapons of mass destruction that don't exist, and droning white-hot flaming death on innocent children all over the globe, we, the American people, will not use bad words or offensive phrases to prove we are a just and moral people. And my message to those Seattle officials worried about certain words and phrases, you might want to look a little further to the east down the I-90 at a place called Hanford, which is a major, major radiological disaster right in the middle of the United States of America. I know a lot of people are always talking about radiation coming in from Fukushima, but that is a tiny part of the exposure problem. You've got Hanford that has been leaking radioactive materials into the atmosphere and into the Columbia River, and they can't get it under control. And some of the facilities there are now deemed possible of having a criticality event. In other words, because everything's leaking and corroding and mixing together, they could get spontaneous nuclear reactions inside this facility. They could heat it up, melt it, start fires, pour tons of smoke into the air. Nobody wants to talk about Hanford. We don't talk about Hanford. We built a lot of bombs there. In fact, Hanford is where they made the plutonium that was used in the nuclear bomb dropped on Japan and in the Trinity test. Anyway, let's see. Well, the July jobs report is out, and the job force participation rate did fall in July. And again, it showed the vast majority of job creation are part-time jobs to evade Obamacare. They're still claiming the unemployment rate is 7.4%. That, of course, is complete nonsense. Less than half of Americans have a full-time job at this point. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. We're talking about the June jobs report, which shows a continuing trend of letting Americans go from full-time jobs on which they can live and support their families and replacing them with these minimum wage part-time workers to evade Obamacare. And it has reached a point of ridiculousness. I think every American at this point needs to basically ask themselves, are you okay living like this? Because right now, according to the latest studies, 80% of Americans are basically living in constant fear of losing their jobs, losing their homes. 80%. That's not the greatest nation on earth any longer. Is this nation, is this government working for we the people? And I think the answer is a resounding no. Like I was telling that caller earlier, the U.S. government can spend billions and billions of your dollars, you know, supporting these hired mercenary Al-Qaeda in Syria, supporting Israel, sending bombs and stuff all over the world. They can't afford to save Detroit. They can't afford to bring back manufacturing. Can't afford to keep the roads and bridges in good repair. That's not what we pay taxes for, those of us who can still afford to pay taxes. We pay taxes to develop and support and build this country. not somebody else's country. Now, interesting little wrinkle on this. This is a story coming out of RINF.com, and apparently the Pentagon is already fretting over a mandated $500 billion in budget cuts over the next decade. Oh, gee, they're not allowed to have any more money. They're going to have to cut some programs, and apparently what is now being discussed is the complete cancellation of the F-35 fighter program. Now, we've talked about this before. It is not a very good platform. It's performing so poorly that the Pentagon has literally already rewritten down the requirements about what this plane is supposed to do in order to be able to say, yes, it met its goals and we can accept it. This plane has cost more than the gross domestic product of Australia to develop and still doesn't work. The naval variant won't even land on a carrier because they put the arrestor hook too close to the main landing gear. I mean, dumb mistakes. No visibility to the rear. Can't turn as fast as it was supposed to. A lot heavier than it was supposed to be. Even the Pentagon admits if it got into a dogfight with the contemporary Russian fighter jets, it would probably lose. And so they're talking about canceling it. Of course, it would have been nice to have canceled it before they wasted $400 billion developing this thing. Because when they cancel the program, that means that that money's just completely flown off into space and we'll never get it back. And it will mean loss of jobs here in the United States of America, which would be okay if there were private sector aircraft jobs for them to go to. But Boeing's still having more and more problems with their Dreamliners. So it's really messed up. F-22, 4 years, going on 5 years on, still asphyxiating its pilots. Military procurement is just this gigantic fraud. Somebody actually sent me a photo from inside, apparently some kind of military supply company, of a little plastic bag with a bolt in it. And attached to it is the paperwork about how much it cost the taxpayer for that one bolt to be delivered. And it comes out to $45. I can go down to the Home Depot here and get the exact same bolt for 19 cents. It's just a giant money-making machine resting on the backs of the American people, and Eisenhower did warn us about it, the military-industrial complex. It's not about war, it's not about peace, it's about soaking the American people for lots and lots of money to protect them from the evil communists. I'm sorry, that's out of date. What are we afraid of this week? We're afraid of Al-Qaeda. We're afraid of terrorists. We're afraid of global warming. We're going to bomb global warming until it capitulates. Now, interestingly enough, I don't like to spend a lot of time talking about other on-air hosts or other shows, but this story I felt was rather important, and this relates to Coast AM, on which I've been a guest on one occasion, and they were going to do an interview with Dr. Michael J. Wood, who is a professional conspiracy skeptic. He makes his money running around saying people who believe in conspiracies are wacko, kook, tinfoil hat wearing loons who should never be listened to, and apparently he's making quite a healthy living doing that. And they were coming on to talk about some of the current concerns of the American people, like the fraud behind 9/11. And apparently, Dr. Wood's study on conspiracy theories was not getting read at all. Nobody was paying attention until Dr. Kevin Barrett wrote about it, and that made it a big issue, and that's what got the Coast to Coast interview. But when Wood came on to Coast, Dr. Barrett demanded equal time to present both sides of the story about modern conspiracy theory, and apparently Dr. Wood said no, and Coast to Coast has had to cancel the interview. Now, what this tells us is that these corporate government mainstream apologists, whether they like it or not, and despite how much money they are being paid, are not capturing the public interest and publicity that we here in the alternative media do. They have lost the war for the minds of America, and they don't know what to do about it. That's why we call it the corporate media. They're not the mainstream anymore. We are. Now, speaking of fraud and propaganda, we all remember that lame story where the supposed nurse from Kuwait testified at the United Nations how those evil Iraqi soldiers had invaded the hospitals in Kuwait, taken premature babies out of the incubators and put them on the cold floor to die, and taken the incubators back to Iraq. And the story turned out to be a complete fraud. It was a hoax manufactured by public relations firms Hill and Knowlton. The girl was not even really a nurse. She was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador. And the whole thing was staged to just enrage Americans against those evil Iraqis who would do such a cruel thing. Well, recently there's been this viral video of a supposed 11-year-old child bride who escaped from this arranged marriage to a man who was mistreating her. And it was all over the place. And basically, oh, Yemen, what bad people they are over there, ahead of a possible incursion. Well, apparently, and this is being reported in the Daily Mail, is that there are now doubts that this video is actually real and that this girl is who she says she is. And apparently Yemen's leading children's right group now says they're convinced the story is pretty much made up. And there was no arranged marriage. It's just a piece of propaganda to try and pre-sell us all that we have to go into those evil Arab Muslim countries and make them live their lives the way that we do. Yet another fraud that was exposed is Iran's brand new president, Rouhani, made a statement that the continued Israeli occupation of Palestine had inflicted a wound on the Muslim world. That's what he said on TV. Now, by the time Memory got through with it and it reached the Western press, the translation read, "The Zionist regime is a wound that has sat on the body of the Muslim world for years and needs to be removed." And this reminds us of what they did with Ahmadinejad when he said that Israel must vanish from the pages of history. Because even back then, it's obvious they're in as much trouble politically as the United States government. And it was mistranslated to Israel must be wiped from the face of the earth to inflame Americans. Oh, bad Iran for saying something like that. Meanwhile, of course, we have all these people inside Israel on tape saying that Iran or Gaza or Palestine have to be wiped from the face of the earth, and the American media, of course, never pays any attention to it. Alrighty, we're coming up here on another commercial break. When we come on back, some interesting stuff in the aftermath of Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman and how it was shamelessly and continues to be shamelessly exploited for political gain. We'll be. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. And we know that a great deal of emphasis was put on the stand your ground laws relative to the altercation between George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin. George Zimmerman claimed he had a right to defend himself when he was attacked by Trayvon Martin. Others contend that because Trayvon Martin was simply standing there when George Zimmerman stalked and approached him, that Trayvon Martin was covered by Stand Your Ground. But apparently this is an issue only when they can use it to generate headlines, because there was another case down in Florida in which an abused wife, while being threatened in her home by her abusive husband, they were separated and apparently there was a TRO on him that he was not supposed to be there, and she fired a warning shot inside her home to escape a brutal beating against her husband, for whom she already had a protective order. She didn't hit anybody with the gunshot. Nobody was wounded, nobody was killed, and the judge gave her 20 years in jail for pulling that trigger, saying that the stand your ground defense apparently does not apply to an abused wife in her own home facing off an abusive husband for whom law enforcement already knows he's a threat. Now, there's another aspect of the Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman case I want you to pay attention to. We saw people like Al Sharpton and various other so-called civil rights activists coming out there and screaming about this murder by a white man against a black man, and oh, the black was the victim and the whites were evil. Little statistic you should keep in mind. In the 503 days between the Trayvon Martin shooting And George Zimmerman's verdict, 10,865 black people were murdered by other black people. And I'll bet you can't name any one of them. Because these so-called civil rights leaders can't make political hay with black on black or even white on white violence. It becomes an issue for them only when it's white on black, and then they can go out and make speeches and collect speaking fees and sell books and pamphlets and request donations. All violence is wrong. It doesn't matter what color the perpetrator is, what color the victim is, what gender they are, what race they are, what religion they are, what orientation they are. The violence is wrong, and it should all be treated equally. But we know the Trayvon Martin Zimmerman case was being intentionally fanned up in the media to sell America that there is a racial crisis, that we should be watching those differently colored people across the street so that we don't pay attention to what this federal government has been doing. But just keep that statistic in mind. Between Trayvon Martin's shooting and the final verdict in the Zimmerman trial, over 10,000, almost 11,000 blacks were killed by other blacks. No big deal, just business as usual. Can't make political gain out of it, so it's just not important. Those other nearly 11,000 blacks were nowhere near as important as one Trayvon Martin, because Trayvon Martin can be used to sell the agenda that there's a racial crisis in this country. The real crisis is extreme poverty created by private central banking. The real crisis is a government that has abandoned its role as arbiter between the desires of financial interests and the welfare, the general health and welfare of the entire country, and is now firmly ensconced with the money junkies. And that, too, is fascism. All righty, we're going to grab a real quick phone call here. Charles in South Carolina. Aloha, Charles. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Aloha, bud. I had read on the internet, or I had heard, that, hang on just a minute, let me step away from the computer.
Okay, I guess you got to turn down your speaker because I'm hearing an echo there. And, yeah, when you're calling into the show, if you're listening to the show on a speaker, you need to turn that down, otherwise we get an echo, and it comes through my headphones about a second later. And I keep thinking, I'm interrupting myself. I keep wanting to stop and say, oh, yeah, you go first. And it's my own voice I'm hearing. Okay, Charles, are you back yet?
Yes, okay. Like I say, I had read on the internet or seen on the internet where the lady in Florida, she had a restraining order on the man, but she had went to his house, and that's where the incident had happened. And they had gotten some kind of verbal argument, and she had left and then came back and then continued to argue, and that's when she fired the gun.
Okay, well then, if that's true, I stand corrected. She should have not provoked that incident. And in that case, I'd have to back off and say that the judge is correct. The report I heard was that she was in her own home when the altercation happened, and I'll need to go back and take a look at that.
Well, that was the whole thing. I just don't know whether you got the facts right, you know, and who knows, you know, when you're on the internet, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I'll go back and do some more research on that one, because my understanding from the original story was that she had been in her own home. And we need to sort of double check that one. But if she was in a neutral zone, like out in public, I think stand your ground would still apply. But if she provoked this, let me go back and take a look at that. And we do know a lot of stuff gets put out on the internet to confuse issues, to try and spin things to suit certain political agendas. Like I said, the original story I had was that he had come into her home in violation of the protective order, and that was the reason she pulled the trigger. So we'll go back and take another look at that one. Thanks a lot, Charles. I'm going to let you go here. A couple of developments breaking during the last commercial break. The House of Representatives has now subpoenaed Treasury Secretary Jacob Lew for more Internal Revenue Service documents. The committee examining the IRS targeting of political dissidents, their chairman, Darrell Issa, is basically saying that President Obama is groundless, saying that this is just a phony scandal. These incidents really did happen. They're still trying to cover it up. The FBI is supposed to be investigating this targeting of dissidents. Apparently, none of the targeted Tea Party or Occupy groups have even been contacted by the FBI to get their side of the story. This is a classic, this is what you're going to believe, and we're going to feed it to you. And apparently ICE is out there saying that Mr. Liu is actively attempting to thwart congressional investigation. And remember, the Treasury Department, as part of the executive branch, is in fact answerable to the United States Congress. So this is another scandal that is really kicking up. I expect that we're going to see a lot of focus on the IRS scandal, because that one they can probably dump right onto President Obama by reviving the memory of how Richard Nixon used the IRS to target their political opponents. Same thing with Benghazi. If it is exposed as a staged political stunt, that just falls directly on Obama, and they can kick him out and say life goes on as it did before. But the other scandals like NSA spying, that delegitimizes the entire government all at once. At this point, I think it is delegitimized. I don't see this federal government as legitimate as long as they refuse to comply with the limitations placed on them by the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. They cannot be a legal government while they do that. They cannot be a legitimate government while they do that. They're just a bunch of thugs with a lot of guns and hollow point ammunition scaring you into obedience, and that, of course, is the essence of dictatorship. Now, amazingly enough, over at PBS, no less, they're running a story of two former NSA officials who have come forward to say that, yes, in fact, the NSA is not just collecting the metadata on your phone calls, they are recording word for word every domestic phone call in the United States of America. And we're not surprised, because when they told us the size of that data center in Utah, and we did that calculation, it was way too big for just the metadata. And now we've got a confirmation. They are recording your phone calls. So be sure and use words like Allah and anthrax just to wake them up. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And before we go back to the phones here, I did a little digging over the break. And the story, as reported in Huffington Post, is that this woman, Alexander, and her husband were still cohabitating at the time of the incident that led to this stand your ground 20-year case. They were having a fight in the home they shared. She fled to the garage, not another house, not another building. She fled into the garage, but apparently couldn't lock the door. And at that point, she grabbed the gun, which was kept in the garage, and returned to the house, and when Gray threatened to kill her, fired one shot into the wall to warn him off. So that is the story. The idea that she went over to his house, that's not what was reported. They were cohabitating even though she had a protective order out against him. And she left the house to the garage, couldn't find safety in the garage, came back. Now, were there some questionable decision-making going on? Yes. Best idea would have been for her to leave. But apparently, there is no question this man had been beating her, including when she was pregnant. And I think a 20-year sentence is excessive in the extreme, especially for somebody who fired a shot that did nothing but damage the plasterboard. All right, we're going to grab a couple of phone calls here. Kyle in Philadelphia. Aloha, Kyle. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mike. I wanted to talk about organized government-sanctioned racism, which gets nearly no coverage anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by this is, in the 2000 election in Florida, a spoiled vote, one that the chat isn't broken correctly or the bubble isn't circled right. There were 9,000 spoiled votes for black people against every one spoiled vote against a white person.
Yes, I know.
You hear, and all this is coming directly from the great.
Now, hang on, before you go any further, that was not based on racism so much as on the realization that blacks generally tend to vote Democratic and the whites are voting Republican. So it wasn't racist, it was partyist.
Well, if it's partyist, it's still heavily favoring a race versus another race, and I understand the motivations are different.
Yeah, they were targeting. They weren't targeting. They weren't specifically targeting blacks. They were targeting potential Democrats.
Well, okay. And another statistic would be, if a white person is arrested with a gram of marijuana versus a black person is arrested with a gram of marijuana, the white person is 5 times more likely to receive a lesser sentence, whereas a black person is 5 times more likely to do jail time for the same exact crime.
Now, that I will agree with. I mean, sentencing disparity based on race, that absolutely is well documented.
I mean, I could sit here for hours. Like I said, this is all reported by the great UK Guardian reporter Greg Pallas, and the fact that it gets absolutely no coverage whatsoever in any, very little in the alternative news and none whatsoever on the mainstream news is shameful. The fact that Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton and all these people don't, because these have real effects on people's lives.
Of course it does. Of course it does. And
somebody calls somebody a name or somebody does something, ignorant, that's not going to affect the trajectory of your life. But if you're more likely to go to jail for crime that somebody else of a different persuasion or color isn't supposed to, that's a real travesty that needs to be addressed above all else. And the fact that no one talks about it speaks volumes of the lack of education and the lack of information that reaches from black leaders down to their congregation.
Well, we've talked about it an awful lot. I mean, again, if some black guy goes into a 7-Eleven and robs it of a few $100s, he's going to go away to jail for 10 to 20 years. Some Wall Street executive robs the American people for $50 billion, and with the exception of Bernie Madoff with the loot, they don't even get arrested or charged. And we know there's a great deal of injustice in this country that is institutionalized not just along racial lines, but along financial lines, along religious lines. Look at all the harassment being directed against Muslims, ostensibly because of 9/11, even though the evidence says that 9/11 was a staged false flag attack by the United States government aided by Israel.
And it really is this divide and conquer, this separation of, black, white, male, female, religious, and we need to realize that that's not the true separation in America.
No, it really isn't. And again, if you go back and study the history of COINTELPRO, COINTELPRO was going out there intentionally staging phony events to try and divide the population, like the Black Panther coloring book or the faked staged riot at Disneyland to discredit the anti-war movement. They were going after the Native American movement. Leonard Peltier, classic case of a frame-up to get this activist put in jail for the rest of his life. They went after the early feminists. The government has been doing this all along. The difference is now the American people understand that's what's going on, and there really isn't an actual divide between blacks, whites, Hispanics, gays, straights, men, women, young, old. We're all a single American people, and the cause of all of our problems that we're dealing with is that predatory financial structure on Wall Street and a government that is firmly in their pocket.
The divide in this country is no longer race or religion. It's the exploiters versus the exploitees.
That's absolutely right. You are absolutely correct.
Until we can, if we would have that realization that we're all in this boat together and the captains are crazy, we don't stand a chance.
Well, it's all has to do with what the captain's agenda is. Now, the captain of a ship is bound by law to do what the owners of that ship tell him to do. If he doesn't, he's guilty of the crime of usurpation. This ship, the United States of America, is owned by the American people. And our government are the hired custodians to take care of the nation for the American people. And if they're not doing that job, if they're strip mining the wealth of the nation to put in their own pockets or to hand to their buddies in other countries or on Wall Street, that's usurpation. And that is why that word is actually in the Declaration of Independence, because the British government that we had before was usurping the wealth of the taxpayers for their own private purposes, not for the benefit of the nation. And we're back in the same situation today.
All right, Michael, I'll let you go. Have a great weekend.
All right, thanks an awful lot. We're going to switch over to James in South Carolina. Aloha, James. Welcome back to the show. What's on your mind?
I got a question about the Federal Reserve.
Yes.
I don't mean to be contentious, about this, but the other day you were talking about the 1913 vote.
Yes.
And I'm asking you this because, I mean, you seem interested. Well, when the vote was taken, it was overwhelming that it passed.
Mm-hmm.
And it was there was I can't think of the word right now, a quorum in both houses when it was passed.
Mm-hmm.
And the House vote was so overwhelming that even if all the members in the House that were gone had come back, it would have still passed.
Well, that is something that is in a bit of a gray area, because I have seen about 4 or 5 different descriptions of how many people were in the Congress over that Christmas break, because it was the Christmas break, and whether or not a quorum was actually there or not. But we don't need to really argue about that so much, because that entire vote and the Federal Reserve Act are unconstitutional. The Constitution vests money creation authority in the government and does not authorize its transfer or delegation. In order to transfer the National Money Creation Authority to a privately owned bank, that should have required a constitutional amendment. But because they were having difficulty with the amendment they had just passed, the 16th, they decided not to take the chance, apparently, and they ran this bill through. Woodrow Wilson signed it, but it's unconstitutional. You can't simply vote to change the Constitution. It takes an amendment. There's a process in the Constitution that you have to follow to change it. You can't just vote and say, we're suspending the Second Amendment, we're suspending privacy. I mean, they're acting like that, but all of it's illegal. They're not playing by the rules here. And the reality is that Congress back 100 years ago was just as greedy and corruptible as Congress is here today, and those bankers were handing out money left and right to buy the government's permission to hijack the nation's economy, to turn the public currency from a public utility into a private money-making venture that they have been running for 100 years to the ruin of ordinary working America, and the time has come for it to stop. We have to take a break here for a couple of commercials, and we'll be right back with one more phone call after these words from our sponsors. Hi, America. Welcome back to the show here. And if you want to be a pirate, you need to go up there on Wall Street, because that's where all the best pirates are now, hoisting the Jolly Roger, plundering the nation, and celebrating as they get away with it because the government's looking the other way and partaking in the booty. Now then, over here in Hawaii, I've often commented that we have about 5,000 homeless people over here, and it turns out I was wrong. The current estimate now is 7,500 people are homeless here on the island of Oahu. And it is a major, major scandal. Now, earlier this week, Hawaii started a pilot program funding $100,000. And according to this other story that was in Daily Mail, they're claiming we have 17,000 homeless people. So the numbers are all over the place. That's a lot. I mean, there are a lot of homeless. And I remember when I was working with Lost, there was this school that was empty during the summer that we used as a location for episodes. And just over the fence from the back of the school was this gigantic homeless camp that surrounds the whole north shore of what's called the center lock of Pearl Harbor. And it became a national embarrassment when Dog the Bounty Hunter did a segment where they went into this area to try and find a fugitive. And they were in there for something like 5 days without being able to find him. And it went all over national TV. And everybody's saying, are there really homeless camps that gigantic in Hawaii? And the answer is yes, they are. They're not easy to see because the law enforcement keeps the homeless out of the tourist areas and jams them into places where tourists generally don't go, like around the shores of Pearl Harbor, up into the Halemanu area, the mountains, and so forth. And so I'm a little shocked to see this quote in the Daily Mail that our homeless problem is 17,000. They may be including the other islands as well. So they're saying Hawaii's just going to buy one-way tickets for homeless people, put them on a plane, get rid of them. It's not quite that simple. Okay, it's a complicated issue. Working with the hungry and the homeless here, we have discovered that actually many wealthy communities on the mainland, in order to get rid of a few unsightly homeless people have been giving them one-way tickets to Hawaii to get rid of them. Because if they don't do well in Hawaii, it's not like they could walk back home. And we, of course, anybody who calls us or emails us and says, I'd love to live in Hawaii, what's the best thing we can do? We say, stay away. Unless you have a job guaranteed for you when you arrive, you should not move here. Come and visit, come and play tourist, get your crotch groped by the TSA, get your luggage looted, go out on the beaches, have a good time. Don't plan on moving to live here unless you've got a guaranteed job. The problem is, we have a major problem with families who will spend their savings to move here for a job, and the job simply evaporates. It vanishes under austerity, military budget cuts. The business that was going to hire them goes out of business or has to cut back to keep from going out of business. And these families are here in Hawaii, and they've spent their savings to get here, and they don't have the money to go. So they get stuck here. These are not people who deserve to be in this situation. Now, there's an old joke up in Alaska that an Alaskan sourdough is somebody who is sour on Alaska but doesn't have the dough to leave. And Hawaii may be more pleasant to be stranded in, but the same mechanism applies. Yes, we're part of the United States of America, but we're also a group of islands stuck in the middle of the Pacific. And coming here or leaving is not trivial. Claire and I have been talking about moving back to the mainland so she can harass more choirs with her music and I can do more public appearances. But the estimates for the move, even leaving most of our possessions behind, it's $12,000, which is hard to come by in this economy. And everything, of course, is more expensive here in Hawaii because of multi-layered excise taxes and the local government's attitude that people will be willing to pay more taxes because this is Hawaii and it's a status to live here. Well, it used to be, maybe not so much. So a lot of people will come here, even those that have enough money to leave when their jobs that they were promised evaporate, they have to leave everything behind, and we'll see it dumped on the curb. You know, a bailout pile. You know, where everything they had is on that curb. We used to loot those piles to find computers to get parts for Hawaii's Computers for Kids program. Now we can't do that anymore because the state of Hawaii passed a law that once it's on the curb, it's their property. You're not allowed to take things out of it because if you need something, you go down to the shopping mall and you pay for it like the good little obedient American that you are. It's hard to think of Hawaii as being a trap, but for many people it has become that. And so what this program is going to do, and I think it's actually a very good idea, is they're specifically going after homeless people who have family back on the mainland who can take care of them if they can only get back there. So we'll see how that is going to work. Speaking of the TSA, the Tourism Suppression Agency, the latest report is that misconduct by TSA employees has gone up 26% over the last 3 years. You would think after all the embarrassments of stealing things from luggage, stealing iPads, dropping and breaking laptops, harassing little tiny babies and wounded military veterans, that the TSA would clean up its act. Quite the contrary. Their abuse is escalating. And even worse, there's another growing scandal about how TSA workers who recognize their friends coming through the line will just wave them through. Yeah, I know you. You're my drinking bud here. You know, and they just wave on through. By the way, if you're going through the airport in the TSA and you don't want to get harassed, get in line behind a really beautiful girl. Because they will just want to spend all their time with her, and they'll just say, get out of here, get on, and they'll wave you right on through here. They've been caught doing that one here. Meanwhile, the United States is demanding from Canada that U.S. law enforcement officers operating inside Canada will be exempt from Canadian law, that they can walk across the border, do whatever it is they're going to do, and come back into the United States of America, and if they should happen to be breaking Canadian law, they cannot be touched. So it's another sign of a government that truly has come to believe that laws are only for the little people, for the serfs, for the plebes, for the workers only. And we, the government, and anybody that we give a pretty badge to, should be above the law. We're certainly seeing that in treatment by police of the American people, where they routinely violate the Constitution and their own local laws and say, I'm going to arrest you just because I'm going to arrest you. Smashing cameras, that kind of behavior. Beating on people. Over there in Idaho, U.S. Representative Bruce Braley, who is getting ready to try and graduate from the House of Representatives to the Senate, is launching his Senate campaign career by, ta-da, heading off to Israel. Over the coming congressional break, he's off to Israel to talk with Israel's leaders about how best to serve the people of Idaho. It's embarrassing. Have you noticed that? It's become a ritual. If you are running for elected office in this country, you got to go to Israel. Got to get your picture in front of the Wailing Wall. Got to daven and bow and scrape to Israel's leaders in order to prove your electability here in the United States of America. Right now, at this point in our history, in this crisis with the economy that we're dealing with and all these other issues, America needs leaders who will put America first, second, and third. We almost had one, Ron Paul, and look how hard they all worked to keep him out of the nomination. It's shameful. The good news is it was so obvious and overt that Americans woke up and realized that long before they ever walk into a voting booth, any candidate who might actually do them any good has long since been erased from the ticket. And that's another reality that we have here right now. Apparently, Google has disabled Press TV's YouTube account and still refuses to explain why Press TV is no longer allowed to post videos to YouTube. Just complete arbitrary, we don't want our people seeing the Iranians as just plain people. Gets in the way of the propaganda. Real quick, oh no, there's the music. Paul, you're going to have to wait till after the break. We're going to break for Phyllis Schlafly News and station identification, a couple of commercials. We will be right back. And yes, Pat, we will get to you first. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show, third hour of the day. And, of course, for those of you on BAM User TV, this gorgeous creature sitting behind me is the lovely lady Claire, who likes to share the microphone at the end of the week with her unique perspectives. Before we turn to Claire, though, we do have a couple of phone calls that I've kept waiting. Pat in Las Vegas. Aloha, Pat. Thank you for waiting. And what's on your mind today?
I want to talk about an injustice that has been perpetrated against the military going back to the Vietnam War. There's an article on the Financial Armageddon blog, which is where I found you, by John LaBoutiere, who was a congressman from New York, about the U.S. cover-up of POW MIA abandoned in Southeast Asia. Mm-hmm. It has been a conspiracy between the Republicans and the Democrats going back to the Nixon administration, mm-hmm. where they reneged on a promise, and those men are serving, or have served, 40 years in foreign prisoner of war camps. And the
let me basically cut in here right now, because you're absolutely right, and it was a scandal, but there's more to the story than that. Amazingly enough, for people who actually listen to the dialogue on these things, the second Rambo movie, Sylvester Stallone included in the script a reference to, because the whole storyline of that was finding these POWs still inside Vietnam and saying that when the United States lost the war in Vietnam, they committed to paying certain reparations to the government of Vietnam. And the United States government said, well, we're not going to give them the money, let them keep the POWs, and the American people will be none the wiser, which for the most part really did work. Now, my understanding from other research that's been done into this is that these men have not spent the last 40 years in POW camps, that once it was obvious the U.S. was never going to pay the war reparations and bail them out, these men were released and basically had, by that time, they had integrated into the Vietnamese society. They had families, wives, kids. They'd learned Vietnamese. They'd set up businesses, and they've basically just spent the rest of their lives there. Which, when you consider what the U.S. did to them and how betrayed they felt, I can't imagine certainly those that did not have families behind in the U.S. probably did not feel a strong compunction to come back, and because of the potential embarrassment, may have been discouraged from doing so. because all it takes is one of these POWs to arrive at a U.S. airport, call a press conference, and it's another huge scandal, and word may have been sent out to simply anybody that has that kind of name on a passport, block them at the far gate. But you're right, and it isn't just Vietnam. POWs were abandoned in Korea. And it all came down to money, where the government said, it's going to cost us too much money to get these prisoners back. They're not very good soldiers, or they wouldn't be prisoners in the first place, and it was made on a purely financial deal. That you're right, it is a scandal.
Well, Terry and the idiot from Arizona held a committee meeting, and they told everyone, you will not discuss this, and they declared the remaining 600 dead.
Yeah.
So anybody who has an illusion that they are not considered serfs and expendable is suffering from a massive delusion.
Oh, the government will gladly throw away thousands of people to make a political point. I mean, look at the attack on Pearl Harbor. We now know that Roosevelt provoked the Japanese into the attack, following an 8-step plan from Office of Naval Intelligence Lieutenant Commander Arthur H. McCollum. We know that the information that the Japanese were coming was well known to Roosevelt and the U.S. cryptographers, but was withheld from the Hawaii commanders, Admiral Kimmel and General Short, in order to be able to say, oh, it was a sneak surprise attack, those dastardly Japanese, and we were off to war. And so as a result, again, look how many people died in the attack on Pearl Harbor that were simply sacrificed to create bloody shirts to wave. Same thing with the people who were in the World Trade Towers when those were brought down. The government loves to have lots of bloody shirts to wave to anger the people into going into war against this year's designated enemy. Pat, going to let you go. We've got one more call, and I do want to get to Claire here very, very soon. So Paul in Canada. Aloha, Paul. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi, Mike. How are you?
Fine.
Good. Listen, that's quite the revelations there, with the Vietnam vets. That's pretty crazy. That's not why I called, though. Basically, I called because I heard you say Ron Paul's name and kind of connected the dots to a previous caller about half an hour, 45 minutes ago that was saying that, there's very little mainstream coverage of the inequality of the prison industrial complex and how it seems to lock up so many black people,
Mm-hmm.
And Ron Paul's been calling that out for God knows how many years, since 2008, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's been his thing, and one of the inequalities there, and I know that the mainstream media likes to crucify him. And
off the top of my head, I can't think of anything Ron Paul ever said that I disagreed with in the political sense, economic sense, and that was why they worked so hard to get rid of him. Up to and including rigging the primary elections. They did it to him in New Hampshire, and then when angry voters who knew they had overwhelmingly voted for Ron Paul requested a recount in New Hampshire, and they came up with the money to fund the recount, and then at that very exact moment, PayPal froze their account to make them miss the deadline so they couldn't get the recount. So you're basically looking, this entire financial money structure as a whole is the new form of government over the United States of America. Will of the people, that's complete nonsense. Due process, complete nonsense. Whatever the money wants, the money gets.
Yeah, I talk to my brother down in Florida a lot, and, he tells me, basically that, when you got a candidate who comes out and tells the truth, people just, well, not people. People tend to, gravitate behind that, but
yes,
the mainstream media just kind of crucified it.
Oh yeah,
but I had a couple of other points though, Mike. One was X key score, right?
Yes.
That's just completely, out of control.
Well, it is out of control, and now we've got that confirmation report from PBS where they've got two former NSA officials saying that, yes, in point of fact, the NSA records every single voice phone call in the United States of America and stores it in that data center. It isn't just the metadata. That was a limited hangout to say, oh, well, it's just contact information, time and date. You don't need to worry about that. But the metadata by itself wasn't really useful, and that data center was way too big to be explained by just saving the metadata. So we knew all along they were saving your voice phone calls as well, and now we have these two former NSA officials who've gone public on PBS confirming that. Every time you pick up that phone, and start talking. The NSA is making a record of it. So be sure and use words like anthrax, bomb, pressure cooker, or ammonium nitrate, and that way somebody over at the NSA is going to drop their coffee cup on their keyboard.
Attaboy, Mike. I'll pass you over to Claire there, and thanks very much.
All right, thank you very much. And Claire, we've got about a minute before the next commercial break. What is the first topic that's hot on your list?
Well, the first topic that is hot on my list is, have we been seeing symptoms that President Obama is mentally unstable? Now, that's not
Is this a trick question?
Now, I don't like to throw around characterizations like this, but you have to look at sort of a combination of what he's said, what he's done, and how he has behaved ever since taking office. And there are some things that I find really, really troubling. One of the things that he seems to have done, very much like Hitler did, and Ayatollah Khomeini, he likes to create a cult of personality around himself. So the image is a lot more important to him than what he does or what he says.
You know, that is a very important point to make. And yes, if you go back and study history, every great tyrant or dictator created a personality cult around themselves. And by the way, that's not a legitimate form of government.
No.
And basically what it is, it's a very highly priced, highly paid circle of people who will tell the leader what the leader wants to hear, not what he needs to know. We got to take a break for commercials. More about this when we come back. Back to the show here. We're talking with the lovely lady Claire, and she's raised a very valid question. Do we have a president who is showing signs of mental instability? And it's a valid question to ask, not only because of the very poor decision-making we are seeing come out of this administration, but remember, it was reported during his first term of office that he was dealing with extreme depression. Now, one question we must ask is that White House physician prescribing SSRI or other similar prescription psychoactive medications to the president? Because we know that while the corporate media is saying that all of these blessings from the pharmaceutical industry are wonderful and would never hurt you, we know there is a long, well-documented history of these medications interfering with clear thinking. The most extreme examples, of course, are mass violence, suicide without explanation. If you go over to ssristories.com, you will be able to read on literally hundreds and hundreds of case studies about this. And if we have 10% of the American population on these medications, then we have 10% of the government on these medications, probably higher because it's a high-stress occupation. And if the president is on these medications, if his advisors are on these medications, then we are in a serious, serious possibility where they're going to go on making worse and worse decisions. Because we have seen several times over the last several years where they attempt some kind of a fraud or propaganda or deception, and it simply does not work out the way they were obviously planning it would. Fanning race riots with Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman being the most recent example. From the corporate media the whole week ahead of time where they were saying Zimmerman acquittal, riots, Zimmerman acquittal. They were planning on that, and the plan did not work. They're making bad decisions. They are showing signs of poor thinking and poor decision making. And again, this idea of a personality cult, this fawning little clique centered on the leader, where you have all these highly priced yes men and yes women who are protecting their phony baloney jobs by telling the leader what they think he wants to hear rather than what he needs to know. And that increases our danger, especially as fingers seem to be edging closer and closer to those release keys on the nuclear weapons.
Yes, there was a very interesting article put up at Wall Street Journal by Daniel Henninger, and he talks about a sense of the mood of Americans who, in an unprecedented way, are finding themselves more and more terrified and afraid of this president. And the reason for that is something that Henninger describes as the president's creeping authoritarianism. Well, I would describe it as the president's galloping authoritarianism. You know, and there's not a sense of optimism. 4 out of 5 people are in some kind of financial danger. They feel like they're just being weighed down, and there's just no optimism out there. And I have to look and think, about some of the things that we are seeing, particularly in light of the recent Snowden revelations about the NSA. We now live in the time of the institutionalization of the surveillance state, courtesy of this administration. And one would have to wonder, would these not be the actions of someone who was extremely paranoid and desperate to be in control, commander-in-chief? Mike, it's one of the first times that I felt very grateful about the two-man rule with nuclear weapons.
Well, if both men on the two-man rule are on those SSRIs, we're really kind of messed up here. But we are definitely back in Richard Nixon territory.
Yeah.
Historians look back at the Nixon presidency and they recognize he was suffering from intense paranoia. Mm-hmm. And again, that is something that tends to follow along when you are a person who is engaging in immoral, unethical, and illegal actions to further your own power and wealth. Right. Over time, you begin to think everybody that you ever stepped on is looking for an opportunity to step on you.
They're out to get you.
They're out to get you. Yeah. We know that our presidents are very paranoid compared to other world leaders. Just look at the heavy armor they're constantly surrounded with. Secret Service checking out people at food distribution centers like they did to us. That is the sign of a paranoid leader, when they are out there spending all this time and effort on people who clearly are no real direct physical threat to the president. We merely disagree with his policies, and that does not mean a threat. That's our First Amendment right under the Constitution. But this targeting of dissidents with the IRS was a classic sign of Nixon's paranoia, and it does seem that I think a case could be made that it's time to invoke the 25th Amendment, except that would give us Biden as president, and I'm not sure that's a step upward.
But I'm looking at these decisions and legislation that has been crafted in foreign policy decision. It kind of looks like grabbing and grasping the tools for total control of the American society. And I look at what the NDAA allows, which is the ability to have the president authorize the military to grab and hold any American indefinitely without due process. President Obama has authorized extrajudicial assassinations without due process. And torture still continues at Gitmo and Bagram and places, black sites that we don't know anything about.
Now, I want to make a comment here. Obama can say that the president, has authorized detention of Americans without trial. He can say he has authorized warrantless extrajudicial execution of people around the world. But in point of fact, the Constitution does not authorize him to do that.
No, it doesn't.
These are all illegal actions. When Obama directs a drone into another country and it kills 50 people, that is an act of murder under color of authority.
Yes.
And we, the American people, because this is our nation, ultimately, we are responsible to keep the government under control, to force that government to play by the rules under which we allow them to manage this nation. And that, of course, is that Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And we can't just sit on our rears and expect the government to sort itself out eventually. I've been an observer of the government very, very closely for almost 20 years now with my websites and radio shows. This government cannot correct itself. It's not interested in correcting itself because the more and more abusive they become of you, the American people, the richer and more luxurious their own lives become. They, like the Wall Street money junkies, are addicted to their wealth, and we've all seen people who are addicted to heroin or cocaine or meth or whatever, how they can construct a worldview that justifies their behavior and what they do to others to feed their addiction. And that's what we're dealing with right here. And this is why the Founding Fathers, when they created this country, they deliberately set out to make that central federal government as weak as possible, because they knew that federal central government was going to be lusted after by money junkies and power freaks, control freaks. And they wanted to say, you don't get to do this job unless you're willing to work within a very limited set of authorities and powers.
Right.
And so any president, any member of Congress who steps outside those bounds is no longer a member of the legal, legitimate government of the United States of America. They're just powerful and influential people dealing death and deception and fraud for their own personal gain. And they're no longer the legal leaders of this country.
Yeah, they have certainly behaved in a way that is illegitimate and not in keeping at all.
And now's the time for all Americans to say that. The American people need to stand up and understand it is socially acceptable to say the federal government of the United States of America is no longer legitimate. They are not playing by the rules we the people said they had to follow in order to manage this country. It's like if you own a building and you hire a janitor to take care of the place, keep the floors clean, keep the light bulbs changed, and you find that janitor stealing money from the petty cash, stealing your office machines to sell them, and then the janitor starts acting like he's in charge of it all, you would fire that janitor. And that, of course, is ultimately the remedy for that attitude problem on the part of your employees. We'll be right back after this. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. And Claire, the next thing that you wanted to talk about was...
Well, I'd like to talk about some of these other decisions that indicate that perhaps the mental processes of this president are not in the most stable state right now. Wasn't he the candidate who said that he was going to absolutely get out of Afghanistan? That was going to be one of the first things he did as president?
He said that back in 2008. In fact, I even have the audio file right here. Let me cue that up.
Okay.
I will promise you this, that if we have not gotten our troops out by the time I am president, it is the first thing I will do. I will get our troops home. We will bring an end to this war. You can take that to the bank.
And now we know why the banks are in such trouble.
Yeah. What he did was he doubled down in Afghanistan, and there is absolutely no military metric by which the U.S. and NATO commanders can say they won. There is nothing. And what really concerns me deeply is that this appears to be a very publicly funded and fought war, ultimately for private profit.
Well, all of these wars, all these wars are for the bankers ultimately.
Yeah.
And if we understand that Obama got his job at the Oval Office with his instructions, you will keep these war going. You know, he's doing what he was told to do by his owners. I mean, you know, Obama is out there, you know, promising he's going to keep his commitments to Israel and keep his commitments to whatever. He's never kept his commitment to the people because we don't count.
No.
That's not necessarily in and of itself a sign of mental instability. It's just a sign of corruption.
Yeah.
I'm more concerned about the fact that some of these propaganda operations they're putting out into the American public are not well thought out. They're basically, the propaganda is taking the attitude of, let's try this lie. No, that didn't work. Let's try that lie. No, that didn't work. Let's try that. They've lost the narrative of what's going on. They've lost a cohesive sense of solidarity of whatever this publicly projected image of the U.S. government and its policy is supposed to be. And again, I don't think he's getting good advice from his advisors in handling these situations like Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman, or if he's getting good advice, he's not listening to it.
Yeah, and that is where things get gritty. And the other choice was that ultimatum that he gave Putin over the Snowden asylum issue. There are many things that Vlad the Impaler doesn't appreciate, but getting ultimatums from someone else who is a world actor on the world stage, President Putin doesn't like that very much.
Well, nobody really does.
It was a terrible move.
And we're seeing more and more world leaders just fed up with this bullying approach by the United States government. But again, with regard to Edward Snowden, by taking this attitude against Russia of you will send him home or else, the Obama administration created a political climate in which Russia couldn't send Edward Snowden back home without looking like they were bowing to the U.S. government. And that, of course, Russia could not do. And so if the White House really wanted Snowden back, how they handled it was completely politically wrong. They should have stayed with letter of the law, you know, national security and the rest of it. But the instant they stood up and said, give him back to us or else, they basically guaranteed that they were not going to get the publicly requested response. And that is another good example of either Obama is getting bad advice or he's not listening to what his advisors are telling him and he's just going on his gut. And that kind of obvious irrationality is a grave concern to the American people.
And also, apparently, he's going to refuse to meet Putin one-on-one on the sidelines of an upcoming summit. I believe it's in St. Petersburg next month. Now, we have some family with some little ones, and with a 2 or 3-year-old, you expect temper tantrums once in a while because they're not verbal enough to be able to get what they want to say out articulately. But for the leader of the free world to do this with a temper tantrum, because trust me, Obama and Putin have much bigger fish to fry and much more at stake than the Snowden asylum issue.
Well, I think the reason for that is very simple. Obama met with Putin during the G20, and looking at the photos of their faces after that meeting was over, it was obvious it did not go well. Looking at Obama's face and body language, he clearly did not get what he wanted from Putin, which was an assurance that Russia would back off and let the U.S. invade Syria and Iran unmolested, and Russia's not going to do that either, because they have strategic interests in the Middle East and Central Asia.
Yep.
Russia understands that these wars are all about forcing the world back to Bretton Woods and accepting the dollar as the global trade and reserve currency, and Russia doesn't want to do that.
No.
Putin understands that this hostility is based in part on Russia's taking control of their central bank to turn their public currency back into a public utility, and they're not about to back off that policy because so far it's working out very well for them. And so Obama went in and tried to bully Putin to back off and let the U.S. continue its policy, and Putin told him no. And because of that, I don't think Obama wanted to meet Putin anyway, and is just using Snowden as an excuse to say, I'm not going to talk to this guy anymore, I can't accomplish anything, which is more Obama's fault than it is Putin's.
Absolutely. But it is of concern also, as you have mentioned, there is a closing of a number of embassies around the world that the U.S. is doing this Sunday.
Okay, I want to come back to that later, but we've had a caller waiting on the line very, very patiently here. Brian in Georgia, thank you very much for waiting for us. What's on your mind?
No problem, Mike. Hi, Mike. Hi, Claire.
Hello, Brian.
Just following on y'all's discussion about problems of the U.S. president and how he can just become so isolated and detached from what's really going on. I used to have a internet acquaintance with a fellow who was actually, before he retired, he was a member of, he was an unofficial advisor to quite a few U.S. presidents. And he talked about during the Carter administration, every day Carter would get from some low-level civil servant a synopsis, kind of a distillation of all the big news stories. And it just so happened that this civil servant despised Carter. He hated Jimmy Carter. So all the information, the news and so on that he sent to Carter, to the president every day, was extremely negative and critical stories about Carter's presidency. So that's just one way in which people underneath you can seriously distort and destroy your ability to make wise decisions.
Well, Carter was actually seen as an outsider. He was a reactionary president who got voted in by an American public who was tired of the insiders. And Jimmy Carter's a good man. I don't agree with all of his policy decisions, but he was really not prepared for the sheer viciousness of Washington's inner circle. And he got set up for that crash of the desert helicopters during the Iranian hostage crisis. And, of course, his efforts to get the Iranian hostages released were constantly undermined by George Bush, who was trying to discredit Carter so that Reagan, with Bush as vice president, could become president and go forward from there. And then, of course, once Reagan was in office, there was that attempted assassination that would have promoted George to the center seat a little earlier than he finally got there. So it's a complex issue. We know the president's daily intelligence brief is obviously filtered through the perceptions and desires and ambitions of the intelligence agencies. I think presidents should have sources of information that are outside those chains of command. And very often I talk about the Merlin the Magician in the King Arthur legends, where Merlin was of primary value to Arthur, not because he could cast magic spells, but because as a wizard and not really part of the court system, Merlin could travel equally through all levels of society and find out what people were really thinking, even down to the lowest gatherer of grain in the field, and he could bring it back to Arthur and say, this is what the people are really thinking. You know, it's not a polling organization with their own agenda or possibly being bought, paid, corrupted some other way. And I think presidents need to do that. I would hope that all future presidents are savvy enough on the internet where they can have an unsecured little laptop in the Oval Office. It's not part of the EOS network, so there's no security thing, where he can just sit there and go out and troll the world's press to see what they're saying, so that he's not getting a filtered view through his own staff. Because we have what we call Rivero's layer of hierarchies, which is that all mid-level managers are trying to make sure they're the only ones who know what's going on or how bad things are. They don't want their superiors to crack down on them. They don't want their subordinates to give up hope. And so the lies are being passed in both directions. And if you're sitting on top of 3 or more layers of such mid-managers, you're functionally deaf, dumb, and blind to what's really going on down at the street level. And I think that's something that is afflicting our current White House. We got to take a break for commercials, and we will be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back. My goodness, it's the last segment of our show today. We're almost out of time. We're going to take one more phone call and then wrap up with Claire and head into the weekend. Ethan in New Mexico. Aloha, Ethan. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind? Ethan, are you there? Oh, there you are.
Yes, I'm here.
Yes.
I'm here. Hello?
Yes, you're on the air. What's on your mind?
About Jimmy Carter and Obama, they have something in common. They both put into power by the same faction. Carl Oglesby wrote a book years ago called The Yankee and Cowboy War, and the Yankee faction, or the Trilats, or the Rockefellers, or Zbigniew Brzezinski are all part of it. They put Jimmy Carter in as our first trilateral president. All the presidents since Kennedy was killed, most of them have been cowboys, except for Carter and Obama. And Obama, I think Jimmy Carter has a conscience.
Yes, he does.
Yes.
I don't know about President Obama, but he's blackmailable.
I think at this point we can pretty much say that Mr. Obama does not have a conscience. In fact, I think he fits many of the personality profiles of the classic sociopath.
And he's very blackmailable. He's in the closet. There's allegations of drug use. I mean, if I can get this, I'm nobody. If I can get this off the internet, everybody can. And it seems like there's a third power group beyond the Yankees and the Cowboys, and that's the neocon Zios and the regular Zios, and they seem to hover over, and when they need to pull a string or blackmail somebody or get something done, they seem to be able to...
Can I interrupt here, and I'm going to have to let you go because we're running out of time, but the sum and substance of what you're talking about is that our political system, far from being the two-party system we are all told it is, that in point of fact our ruling structure has become very badly factionalized, with too many little competing covert groups, the Project for the New American Century, this coalition, that coalition, and it's sort of an argumentative point whether this is healthy for the political structure or not. Now, I would argue a multiplicity of parties is good for the public discourse, but I think this plethora of covert, behind-the-scenes groups bent on manipulation is, in fact, quite undemocratic and certainly contrary to the idea of a republic where whatever the government is doing is visible and controllable by the people of that nation. But we do know that we have all of these different groups of people, Bilderbergers and Council for Relations and the rest of them, who are all seeming to adopt Henry Kissinger's attitudes that the issues facing the nation are far too important to leave up to the voters, forgetting that this nation belongs to those voters, and those voters are supposed to hold in craziness by the government, who are drunk on their own power and wealth, and who have turned the United States of America into a private little scam for their own enrichment and power. And again, I think right now we've hit the phase in history where the American public as a whole, and the Occupy movement was a good start, need to stand up and understand it is now socially acceptable to say this federal government is completely illegitimate. They're not following their own laws. They're not following international laws. They are not following the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. They are lying to us about pretty much everything, and on all those grounds, these are the actions of a government that has delegitimized itself. They're not being attacked from without. That's what all this terror thing is. Oh, there's people out there trying to bring down the government. Actually, we're just going to stand back and let the government bring itself down, because that's what it's doing. Because we're reaching the point where every single American who is sick and tired of living the way that we're living right now is going to throw up their hands and say, I'm not part of this anymore. I'm not going to fill out the forms. I'm not going to send in the checks. You're not going to get my kids. I'm not going to pay attention to anything you say anymore. You had one more thing that you wanted to say.
Yes, and I'll try to make this quick because I know we're at the end of the segment. The U.S. government has now given its seal of approval to Egypt's new leaders. And supporters,
like they had a choice.
Yeah. Supporters of deposed Egyptian President Mohamed Morsi are preparing for confrontation today. And the United States has been coming up with a statement, I think Kerry said it, that Egypt's military has been restoring democracy when they drove him from action. Now,
have you heard the new one? Apparently, the Muslim Brotherhood, who, like Al-Qaeda, used to be our enemies and are now the allies of the United States government.
Yeah.
The Muslim Brotherhood wants the U.S. to invade Egypt because the army hates the Muslim Brotherhood. So there's a strange set of bedfellows there.
Yeah.
Where, the U.S. is already talking about direct military intervention in Egypt to restore peace to the region, and now they find themselves allied with the Muslim Brotherhood, just like we're allied with...
It's insane.
They're planning these things with a dartboard, and it's another indication they've lost control of the propaganda narrative.
Yes.
We're really into Orwell territory. East Asia has always been our ally. We've always been at war with Oceania, and they change the things as fast as they can, and if you actually have a memory of something being different, you must be mentally ill. We're there. Al-Qaeda's the bad guy. Oh, no, Al-Qaeda's our allies. And Muslim Brotherhood are evil. No, now Muslim Brotherhood are our friends, and they're just flipping back and forth.
Yeah.
And the American people are just looking and say, are these guys on drugs in Washington, D.C.? And the answer is probably yes.
Yes.
They are.
And now I'm really trying to get my head around this. When is a coup not a coup? Apparently when the U.S. government says it is not a coup.
When somebody the U.S. wins the office, it's not a coup anymore. It's a struggle for independence and the rest of it. The difference between a freedom fighter and a terrorist is which direction they're pointed at.
Yeah, and this military junta has just resurrected Egypt's reviled and hated secret police.
Well, there's a red warning sign for there. It's probably going to be very ugly in Egypt.
Yeah.
And apparently, the only reason for the United States to say we're in favor of these people is apparently whoever's in charge over there now has said, yes, we will do what the U.S. says. We will help you attack Syria. We will always support Israel. And we're back to Mubarak. We're back to the Mubarak style of Egyptian rule, those poor Egyptian people.
Yeah.
And again, the U.S. is making war on real democracies around the world. They're making war on governments and people that want to live their lives their own way, to try and force the world into this gigantic global fascist dictatorship called the New World Order. And you will like it.
And unfortunately, as we've seen with both Egypt and Bahrain, which consistently represses its own people, democracy and human rights will never be allowed to get in the way of the U.S. government supporting a thugocracy, if the thug-in-chief happens to be to D.C.'s liking.
That's exactly it.
Yep.
These wars are all about getting rid of people who won't do as they're told by the United States and putting in people who will do as they're told by the United States. That's why Obama is making stink face with Putin over taking government control of their central bank. That's why they're making stink face with China over offering the yuan as an international currency. And it's already underway. China has deals with 8 different nations for direct currency exchange without going through the dollar. And that's why the Pentagon is now officially planning for a war with China so that your children who were not killed in Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Pakistan, and where all else, and the entire list of invaded countries is now classified information, so we don't know where the wars are anymore. They're going to now be flung across the Pacific Ocean onto China to teach those gosh darn Chinese to bow appropriately to the almighty Federal Reserve note.
It's scary.
It's scary and it's very sick.
Yeah.
Do you have a short item, or is that pretty much it for the show? That was pretty much it. I'm going to pull down your microphone here. We're about 2 minutes away from the end of the program, and I want to leave you with a thought for the weekend. And I mentioned it earlier in the show, and I'm going to basically recap it here. I want everybody listening to this broadcast to just take a moment of pause over the weekend to look around your home, consider your job, consider your financial security, your financial future, that of your children, and just ask yourself a serious question. Are you okay with life as it is in the United States of America right now? And if you are not, and I suspect the majority of you are, the time has come to simply recognize that. This nation no longer works for we the people. It's not being run to work for we the people. This is currently a nation of the money junkies, by the money junkies, and for the money junkies. And if you are sitting on your rear waiting for the government to correct the problem, or for Superman to fly in and beat up the bad guys, or for the Lone Ranger to come riding over the far hills with Johnny Depp by his side stealing the film, it's not going to happen. If you want a better America, you're going to have to make it happen yourself. Peacefully, non-violently. But just stop cooperating. Stop going along with all this nonsense and just have the courage to stand up to the liars and say, you're full of it, and I will not listen to you anymore. And on that note, have a really good weekend. Try and get some relaxation in. If they're planning a new false flag, it's going to be really, really tense starting next week. So we'll be back Monday here on the Republic Broadcasting Network. Please call your local AM and FM stations and tell them, please put our programming on the air in your neighborhood to help get the word out. We'll be back tomorrow, Monday. Aloha.